This program is supported by Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views and opinions expressed by this program do not necessarily reflect those of Humanities Iowa or the National Endowment for the Humanities. A special discussion covering the history and future of award-winning journalism. Profiles in Iowa Journalism on Iowa Public Television. Here is Dean Borg.
During the past century, journalism has evolved, whether by forces of capitalism, by its delivery mechanism to news consumers, or the whims of a populace evolving and searching for coverage in an ever-expanding sea of so-called journalistic options. But amidst the clamor of news coverage, particularly in an election year, it may be best to revisit some key profiles in Iowa journalism and to rediscover, or discover for the first time, whether the past is indeed a gateway to the future of the Fourth Estate. Joining our conversation today, a group of experienced journalists with plenty of stories and insight. Chuck Offenburger spent decades writing columns at the Des Moines Register. You may know him simply as the Iowa Boy. Lyle Muller, former editor at the Gazette in Cedar Rapids, currently heads the Iowa-based nonprofit journalism news center called Iowa Watch. Michael Gartner spent a lifetime in journalism, from the Wall Street Journal to president of NBC News, later spent some time writing editorials for the Ames Tribune and ownership there. Annah Backstrom is currently news director at the Des Moines Register, Iowa's largest newspaper. Thanks to all of you for joining in this conversation today. I'm looking forward to it. I'd like to ask you first, Annah, though. You've been around the country, as have the people around the table. Does journalism vary in news reporting nuances around the country? That is, would you cover a story differently as a journalist in, say, Jackson, Mississippi than you would in Des Moines or Ames, Iowa?
I think the basic tenets of journalism don't change where you are. Good reporting is good reporting, but you have to know your community. You have to know what issues are affecting your community. What are the issues that people care about? So you might be focusing on one issue because you know at Iowa it's important. Agriculture is important here. It's an economic driver. But in my hometown in Michigan, not as much of an issue. So the skills that you need to write good stories or produce good work don't really change where you are, but knowing your community and what's important to them certainly does.
She says, Lyle, knowing the community. Why is it important to know the community? Why would that influence how you report?
Well, there are things that are important to you as you're a reporter, and a big one is knowing what your audience is and what types of things are important to that audience. We make judgments about that all the time in journalism, where we try to figure out what's reflecting our community and what are the issues that are important. And so I can see the issues changing from community to community and also some of the culture that exists. But I do agree that the basic tenets of finding the truth, what's the fact that is most important for that community so that they can be informed citizens and then have influence over the those who have judgment over them, in other words, government, that doesn't change. It's all about the culture and what that audience is interested in.
Michael, is it what the audience is interested in or what they need to know?
Oh, it's a little bit of both, I think. It's kind of like Professor Harold Hill. You got to know the territory, but you also have to mix your pitches and know what you're doing. Give people some of what they want and some of what they need and some of what interests you.
Mm-hmm. Chuck.
I've always said I wasn't a great reporter. I was a pretty good interviewer, though, and I always would zero in on how people talk and how they behave while they talk and the things they like to do.
What do you mean, mannerisms?
Just good color that goes into a story, about and when you can peg that in a story, the people who are reading it that know those people know you got it right. Mm-hmm. But I really have always just been thrilled at those differences in different places, the different language or different expressions and those kinds of things. So that's one of the first things I'd be zeroing in on when I went into, would you say Jackson, Mississippi, or wherever.
Yes.
Try to pick up on some of that.
Well, as you moved around Iowa, certainly you moved from different people in urban areas, highly sophisticated people, to maybe a welder out in a small town someplace in Iowa.
But a highly sophisticated welder.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. I always said you had to get comfortable when I'd be going out into small towns in Iowa to do a column or a story, that you had to get comfortable because as soon as you walk in the coffee shop or the bank or the barber shop or wherever you're school, wherever you're walking into, I mean, it's like everybody's stranger radar goes off, that there's somebody different here.
Yes.
And so, what I always worked hard on was not starting the interview so quickly, but to try to diffuse that and get people calmed down so they're themselves.
How many
and
of
then
us,
go to work.
How many of us have walked into a coffee shop in a small town in Iowa and covering a story there, but wanting to sample who in town should I be talking with? And just like you say, you walk into that coffee shop and suddenly you're the center of attention. I remember walking into a coffee shop over in Maquoketa, Iowa, after a fire had occurred there and the rubble had lain for quite some time. And I walked into that coffee shop, and they had seen me across the street looking at that. First quip from a long line of men sitting at the table was, "Want to buy a brick?" Because there was a heap of bricks across the street.
Well, the radar for detecting strangers in a small Iowa town is pretty strong. I grew up in a small northeast Iowa town and now work in the Iowa City area, and I can tell you that the version of Iowa City that exists in Iowa City is far different than the version that exists in northeast Iowa about Iowa City. And so even in our own state, we have different beliefs, attitudes, values, and cultures that help shape our thinking.
Let's fess up here, Lyle. What's that town in northeast Iowa?
That town is Fredericksburg.
All right, okay.
Well, I'm going to get into specifics about each one of you. And first of all, Michael Gartner, editorial writing is much more than simply voicing an opinion. Michael Gartner says some of the best advice he ever received on the subject was from a former columnist at the Wall Street Journal. We spoke with Mr. Gartner recently about that advice and his approach to editorials at the Ames Tribune and his Pulitzer Prize winning column centering on the emotional remembrance of his late son, Christopher.
You give the other side the space, and you give your side the thought. And I thought that was just great. In other words, be fair with your facts. Don't pull any punches, you know. But then when you come down to analyzing it, do a good job, and that's how you make your argument. It's like a legal brief, you know. I mean, the facts are always the same, and usually the same, whether it's a murder or embezzlement or whatever. And then you have to make your case. And he says, get all the facts, but he says, then put all your time and all your energy and all your thought into making your case. I thought that was great advice. Then I started writing editorials every day, and I said to myself and to Gary, the editorial will be on a local subject every day. And then I said to myself, nobody cares what I think. I have to prove my point. So to write a good editorial, you have to report. So you have to have the facts, because you shouldn't be able to convince anybody about something just because of who you are or whether you're a good writer or not. You have to have the facts. And so every day I would report, just as the reporters there were doing, and then I'd usually write it at home that night. Every day you would write one, and I tended to write long, but I owned the paper. I used to write about him a lot when he was a little boy, and I wrote about him when he died. It was Christmas, and you think about family, and it just seemed like a nice thing to say, so I did. Easy to write, you know, it just flows. Hard to think about still, but easy to write. And I usually, you know, when you have a child who dies, and that's been 94, that's been, you know, he's been dead 22 years, longer than he lived. But you still think about him 30, 40 times a day. And it still shapes your life. So I don't know why I wrote about it, but I did, and I'm glad I did.
Michael, it's easy to tell that was deeply emotional, still is for you. I read a couple of columns, and it wasn't, you wouldn't consider that to be an editorial. It was a column, was it not?
Well, I wrote about Christopher a couple times.
Yes.
One of them was the day after he died. That was a column. And I think what I'm talking about there was an editorial about, a Christmas editorial.
Yes.
There was a park in Ames that we named after him. And I think that's about that.
Mm-hmm. But the one I also remember and communicated with you about was, I believe, a column when a dog died later.
That was a, yeah.
And
Yeah,
that was
every time somebody dies, I write a column.
well, but
A lot of columns lately.
it related to Christopher and the meaning.
It was, yeah.
I heard something in that when you were talking about writing editorials that really jumped out at me. Most of my career, I was a columnist. I mean, I started out as a news reporter and a feature writer, but then I started writing columns. And, you know, when you have a column, your tendency to just ramble off and, you know, you can just express your own thoughts. But I always thought, in order to have that column, the first thing I had to do was be a reporter.
Yeah, nothing's good without facts.
You know, I had to just really become a good and a better reporter than I was, and so that I had everything with me. And then, like you said, then you think about it and take it, you know, in a direction. But that's the basic is. And I got started on that in my hometown of Shenandoah down in southwest Iowa when I was 14 years old. I became the boys sports writer of the old Evening Sentinel. And I had a University of Missouri journalism graduate as my managing editor, Bob Tyndall, grand old man. And he just hammered that into me. And as a result...
What was it he hammered into?
Being a reporter. I mean, it didn't matter, I was doing sports, but he made it clear. It didn't matter whether it was sports or whether I was on the city side doing something or whatever. You just have to go get the facts.
The best editorials in the state today are written by a guy named Art Cullen up in Storm Lake.
Why are they good?
Because, just what Chuck is saying, because first of all, he knows his town really well, upside down. Mm-hmm. And second of all, he knows his facts, whether he's writing about farm subsidies or whether he's writing about the fight about the Des Moines Waterworks and the counties up there. And then he's a lovely writer as well. So
I was struck by that line in the interview, though. Nobody cares what I think. You were saying that about yourself.
That's right, especially my wife.
but that's what an editorial is. It is your opinion.
No, it's really your analysis more than your opinion. Now, sure, your opinion's in there, but you don't come out and say, "This is what I think." You know, you build it up, and then at the end you say, basically, and you're stupid if you don't agree with me. No, I mean, you know, you build it up you make your case. It's a legal brief.
A good editorial ought to continue the conversation and launch it and inform it so that it's a better editorial. One of the interesting things about what Michael was talking about there, and it relates to your opening question, Dean, about is journalism different in communities? And while we agreed that journalism itself, then the task is not that different, a good editorial, and this is what Michael did with his editorials at the Ames Tribune, talks to the community about community issues. And so I'm struck by the fact that you take so much time to learn about the community and what's important there, and then make it about the readers and the citizens of the community instead of about the editorial writer, or in this case, the Ames Tribune. It was all about the community.
I'm curious, Michael, on winning the Pulitzer, did that vindicate you as a writer in any way? Did it change anything about the way that you approach writing?
No, I mean, I still had to go to work the next day. It isn't like you've won a Pulitzer Prize and you can retire. No, it didn't change. It's nice, you know. It's a nice thing that the 75th anniversary of the Pulitzer Prize many years ago, 25 years ago, Russell Baker, the great New York Times columnist, was a speaker, and every past winner was in the room, or at least everyone had been invited, and he looked out at them all and he said, "I know the first line of the obituary of everybody in this room." And really what it is it changes your obituary, but that's about it.
Yeah. And is the line blurring between the news pages of a newspaper and the opinion pages?
I hope not. But, you know, we hear that criticism often at the Register and I think at newspapers around the country. You know, an editor once said to me, the news pages tell you how things are, and the editorial page tells you how things should be. And I think that that's an important distinction to make to readers too, that, you know, our staff is out covering news in how it occurs every day. And the editorial department is looking to tell you what they think is the best version of that, or why it should be different or changed.
But the choice of what you cover, how you cover it,
Right.
even the headline that's written, the placement in the paper, that is all judgment.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not without some sort of influence.
It certainly is. Editorial judgment is a sticky thing to try and define to somebody or say, you know, this is our editorial standard, because I think depending on the person who's writing the headline of the day or what editor is in charge of running a story for the day, you know, it can go in either direction. But I still think, for the most part, the line is still thick at the Register between what we're doing in the newsroom and what the editorial page is doing.
Chuck, is that changing?
I agree. I mean, I still get into the Register now and then just to say hi to old friends and stuff, and I think it is still a pretty strict line there. It's changing in a lot of ways, though, because of social media, and everybody is a reporter and an editorial writer now.
So now tell me, what's changing because of social media?
Well, people who are not working in the media for their careers.
Yes.
Everybody.
But how is that influencing and changing what we know as traditional media?
Well, so the people who live out with me in Cooper, Iowa, and they're involved on social media, they are used to expressing their opinions on or just sharing news about the community or whatever that everybody does on social media. Then I think they get to start to have the perception in their mind that that's how it is for professional journalists too, and it's not. I mean, professional journalism still separates that. The responsible professional journalists do, I think.
I don't think so, Chuck. You know, it started changing 50 years ago with the Sunday talk shows on television. You know, here'll be a guy who's a reporter 6 days a week, and on Sunday he goes on, and all of a sudden he's given his opinions on Meet the Press or anything. And how is the viewer supposed to distinguish? And so they say, that guy's a reporter of the New York Times. Listen to his views. Of course, the New York Times is a terrible liberal newspaper or a terrible conservative, whatever their views happen to be. And I think that line's just been moving. Your sports department, there's no line at all in your sports department. I mean, you know, one day Randy is writing a column, and the other day he's reporting on a game.
Randy Peterson, who reports on the Iowa State Cyclones,
or the guys who do Iowa. It's wow. It's hard to tell. I think.
What about that, Anna?
Yeah, I think.
But does it bother you?
That example, I don't think so. But I think.
Because it's tolerated in sports?
Maybe.
Okay, let's move on, because you wanted to say something and I interrupted.
I think one of the things that I've struggled with over the past couple of years, and particularly when you get to social media, you have a lot of people who want to make a name for themselves, and they want to have a hot take, and they want to be booked on a Sunday show, or they want to be the reporter who is, you know, on TV or is known and has a big Twitter following. And I think that gets people in trouble, because readers don't distinguish between what you tweet after dinner when you're off the clock and what you tweet when you're in the office.
So it bothers you when your news reporters get on social media and make comments?
I hope that when it does happen, it's few and far between. But yeah, you see it, I think, pretty frequently, particularly in political journalism. And you know, even as an editor now, there are some reporters around the country who I wonder if their editors are looking at their social media feed and thinking, no one's going to be able to look at this and think that you're approaching this without bias.
A reporter today working in politics or any other area, I guess, you have to know when to turn that on and off, because if you are constantly weighing in with your personal opinion about issues, you're going to have trouble covering the other side. And I think you want to be in a position where you have enough respect in the way you conduct your, you conduct your reportage and your writing, that you can go talk to both sides on issues. And I think that you have to be able to do that, particularly in politics. And I can say, like, Bill Petrosky from the Des Moines Register. I've known Petrosky for a lot of years, and that guy is just so straight down the middle on, I can't think anybody can figure totally out where he is on any issue, and it doesn't matter. He's just a good, solid reporter.
Michael Gartner, I am,
Well,
Michael.
there's pressure, though. There's pressure in the industry to do this. Reporters are told you need to be self-promoting now. That's a shift in the industry that's existed, at least in newspapers.
And using social media to self-promote.
Exactly. And that means becoming your own personal brand. And reporters struggle with this. They've struggled with it. When I was at the Gazette, reporters who felt like, the most important thing to me is the fact and the information, and I like looking at my byline, but if someone talks about what's in my story instead of my byline, I'm happier. But now it's an era in which media companies are telling reporters to become their self-brand and to promote that brand, and they have to get attention because of the impressions that they need on their stories.
And there's no editor when they blurt it out.
Exactly.
You're bothered by that, aren't you, Michael?
Well, I'm not bothered by it. I mean, I'm bothered by war. I'm not bothered by reporters blurting stuff out, but I think it damages their credibility and the credibility of their newspaper. I mean, look, the whole function of a newspaper always was to dispense accurate information, and that was the function of the editor, and he was the gatekeeper or the news director on television. And now, on the internet, whether it's a reporter or whether it's just somebody who saw something, there's no editor. So the problem is now it's given over to the viewer. Is you have to be able to discern for yourself truth from fiction, and not everybody, that's not easy to do.
And is it confusing now to traditional readers, viewers, as to what is truth and where does this reporter actually stand? Do you see that? Or
Oh, sure, you see it all the time because they don't know, and they don't have the time or maybe the ability to figure it out for themselves. And so what happens is they gravitate to people who agree with them. So you gravitate to MSNBC or to Fox News or to this or that. I have a friend who's a judge in New York, and years ago when the internet was just social media was just coming in, he said, it's a terrible thing when people get sick and they go on the internet to check their symptoms to see. He says self-medication is a terrible thing. And he said, what's next is self-newsication. and that's right. That's right. You go on to be your own newspaper, and it doesn't work.
But they tend to gravitate toward people that they agree with. But I think also when they really want to learn something, people do have a sense of knowing what reporters are giving it to them straight. I mean, I think they have a perception of that, especially when we're talking about a market where, in Iowa, where people will come to know who the people are that is doing the reporting and commentary.
Michael, I want to take us back to that column that won the Pulitzer Prize.
Well, that was in a package that won the Pulitzer Prize.
Okay, tell me about that.
There were 10 editorials. That just happens to be one that people focus in on because it was so personal. But the others were all about local issues of importance to the people of Ames, or that maybe not important. I mean, one of them was about where I made the case that lap dancing should be protected by the First Amendment. I mean, stuff like that as well, which is...
and came at a time when a lot of newspapers the size of the Ames Tribune were cutting back on editorial voice in a lot of places. And here you had these strongly expressed, well-written editorials on local topics, which turned a lot of heads.
And that's what, it was the 10 that was, but yeah, you're right, everybody focused on the one about my son, Christopher.
And that's the one I want to focus on before we move on. And you made the comment, and I said it once before, nobody cares what I think. And yep, this column was deeply, deeply personal. Did you ever equivocate before you wrote? Did you ever equivocate about writing that thing that was deeply family personal?
No, I rarely write personal things, but
Yes.
this was quite personal, and it was easy to write, and I wrote it, and I thought, well, if they don't like it, they don't like it, you know. It's just in a newspaper, and like I said, I owned the newspaper, so what the heck.
Yeah, but how did you? I mean, when you write one like that, do you share it with your wife?
No, I just wrote it, and it was kind of too emotional to share, to tell you the truth. But no, I mean, it was okay, you know.
I want to take our viewers back now to June 30th, 2009. A married couple in their boat on the Des Moines River went over the Center Street Dam in downtown Des Moines. The boat capsizing, the husband drowned, and a rescue effort was quickly underway to save the woman, and she was still caught in the rolling dam's undertow. Des Moines Register photojournalists Andrea Melendez and Mary Willing, at that time she was Mary Chind, responded to that scene, and both photographers captured captivating images of that rescue. But the editors chose one of Willie's images for the front page of next day's paper and then submitted it for Pulitzer consideration. That photo won the 2010 Pulitzer for breaking news photography, beating out, incidentally, the Associated Press for images the AP had of the war in Afghanistan and the New York Daily News staff for coverage of the U.S. Airways landing in the Hudson River. Here's the experience in Mary's own words.
It was such a far distance across the river, and I did not have a tripod, and so I was zooming in, you know, with my lens's capability. I knew I would have to crop the image, so I was really just focusing on holding my breath still and not, you know, when you get excited, when you're doing anything, your heart pounds and you get a little shaky. So I had my elbows on the dam bridge, the retaining wall there, like making a human tripod, and I was just thinking about focusing. That's all I thought about. Focusing, because I knew that would be, at such a zoomed in distance, it would be critical to be right on. Your work instinct comes into play, first of all. You're just thinking about the story and, you know, just doing your job technically as well as you can. Not until after the hands connected, then it really dawned on me what an amazing thing that had just happened. I mean, I assumed I would have something powerful. I didn't know it would be, you know, just the angles and the interest of it all would work out very well. I think it popped out because of the hand and the angle, the composition of the, you know, the diagonal movement of the lines. For me as a person, would it be the picture I would put on my wall at home? No. And I've got frames, prints of it, and I don't have it hanging on my wall at home because it's a tragic event. This picture's always going to be out there, and it's in the museum and it's in history, and it's just something to be really proud of. It just taught me so many things, little things about life, and that's what photojournalism has done. It's been such a blessing to learn so many life lessons, but one of them is to be prepared for anything, to know that any day, like if you're a construction worker, you could be saving someone's life. And I think that's what inspired so many people about that photograph, is that this is not a man that's trained to rescue people, but here he is in your everyday life. I mean, you can come across a situation at any time, to just be willing to help out. Really, the biggest honor for me was to have them pick a single photo, and as a photographer in the day of the new media, it was exciting to me that a single photo was chosen and it won, because even in the Pulitzer Prize history, you know, lots of times there's bodies of work, there's you know, several photographers working on a project, and all wonderful work. I just think it's really wonderful that one single photo was able to win the award, and that I was able to do that.
It's thrilling just to see that photo again as I saw it.
Sure is.
I have the same feeling as I saw it on the front page of the Register the next morning, and called it to the attention of my family. I knew it was a winner right then. Lyle, you did the interview. What jumped out in your conversation there, if anything particular?
Well, a few things. One was this notion of the Des Moines Register submitting one photo instead of a series of photos, especially when Andrea Melendez was there as well and taking some very good photos herself. But as I think about it, the idea of that one moment in time, that photo, really captured something. And I talked to both Andrea and to Mary about that. You know, the question for Andrea always is, does anyone ask you how close you came to the Pulitzer?
Yeah, no.
And she's heard the question a million times, and she will tell you up front that she thinks Mary's photo was the best photo. And Mary is deferential, has been deferential about that at times because of this idea that she won it and her friend didn't. But I asked Mary that same question, is that the best photo? And what surprised me was she said yes. She finally owned the idea that she took this amazing photo. And again, it gets back to the idea that for her, the photo was important more so than her getting credit for it.
Anna, what lessons, you as an editor, as you dispatch photographers, is it a matter of just being in the right place at the right time, having the right angle, as Mary alluded to, as saying the lines were just perfect and so on? But what can photographers under your control and direction, what can they learn from this?
Well, I think what Mary said in there about being nervous and wanting to do a good job, but also knowing that she needed to execute. In breaking news, that's the last thing I often yell at people is take a breath, you know, and I think Mary's photos show that she took a breath, she set herself up, she got her camera in the right position, and she executed as best she could. And I think that that's really important in those situations when things are going a mile a minute, to remember your training and to know that you can do this.
Well, and she knew what the story could be.
Exactly.
Good photographers anticipate what the story could
Yep.
be. I used to work with a photographer who'd go to Iowa football games and go to the end zone where the team wasn't playing. Right? So if you'd be on the 1 yard line trying to score, he'd go down to the other end of the field because he figured that if something happened bad at the goal line and by happen chance a touchdown would be scored at the other end, he'd be there to capture the photo. And so that's the kind of thinking that's going on there. It's the thinking about the story. You know, there are a lot of pictures of the Beatles walking across Abbey Road in that famous shoot, but there's only one big self-defining photo, and the same kind of principle applies, I think, in this news photo.
And she says, you know, the angles are good and the photo's good because of how things are set up in the composition, and she's right, but the photo's also good because it's emotional, and you look at that and you see this gasping arm reaching for aid.
There's a gap between those
Right,
hands.
exactly.
And there's anticipation.
Right.
Michael, you're contemplating something there, and I know over your experience, you've dealt with these things. You've judged Pulitzers.
I was on the Pulitzer board for 10 years, and I think the Register, in retrospect, did a disservice to the other young woman whose picture was just a terrific picture, too, and it might have been just a hair less terrific, but it was terrific. I think they should have submitted them both. And if the Pulitzer board thought one was better than the other, they would have chosen. But I would say there was an 80% chance it would have been a joint Pulitzer Prize for both of them. And that would have, when you're that age, that would have a big impact on your career. You know, when you're old like I was and you win a Pulitzer Prize and you're set, it's nice. But I think it would have had a major impact on her career.
Well, that begs the question, Michael. You sat on the board. What is the Pulitzer process? If they had had two photos like that, of course, yes, they would have chosen one or the other, but
or both.
Or both. I see.
The process is amazing. First of all, it's absolutely clean. There's no lobbying. Anybody who even works for a chain where there's an entry can't be in the room when it's discussed. The Pulitzer board is made up of 15 or 16 people. 12 or 13 are newspaper people. Most of them publishers or used to be editors. I was one of the few editors still on it when I was on it. And then there's 3 or 4 academics, university presidents. President of Columbia University is always on it. And it goes through a jury system, and they send 3 to 5. They go through all the piles. Anybody can apply. Anybody can can submit for a Pulitzer. I mean, somebody will say, "Oh yeah, you know, my nephew, he was a Pulitzer Prize nominee." Well, that meant he had $60 and could nominate himself. Anybody can be nominated, but the juries then pick 3 to 5. They send it up to the board alphabetically. Then the board office, they send out to you at your house about a month before the meeting all the books and all the articles. So you can read them at home, in front of the fire, while you're petting your dog, whatever. And then you make up your own mind, and then you go in for 2 days of meetings. And you're so sure you're right. You're so sure that this book is going to win it until you hear somebody say, just demolish it and talk about another book. And so there are these votes. And the first day, they're all tentative votes, no permanent vote. And then that night, you sit around and you contemplate and you talk and everything. And then the next day, there's votes. And the votes are often just, 7 to 6 or 8 to 7 or whatever. People would be amazed how close they came to winning a Pulitzer Prize.
Dean, the picture, one of the things that strikes me, it's almost like a metaphor for what we're really talking about here today. You can think about that. What year was that shot?
It was 2009.
2009. Okay, yeah. Well, very much in the video age, and we're even more so down that road now, where everybody's carrying a camera or a phone that can record video and everything. So the media is really changing. But with all of that going on, if you produce something that is really top drawer, dramatic, grab your attention, it still is a huge hit, and that can be a picture. It can be a news story, it can be a column or an editorial or a sports column, it's top quality stuff.
But visuals are still captivating. They'll never diminish. Do they not capture more attention, Anna, than the written word, the printed word? Isn't the visual the impact? Or are visuals, still photography, losing sway?
No, I don't think so. I think in the best case scenario, they support each other.
Yeah.
The art is powerful, the yes. photo is powerful, and the writing is powerful. And sometimes you'll have really powerful art that stands alone without a written story, and sometimes you have a written story that there isn't a good way to illustrate it, or there's not an art option. But in the best case scenario, you've got an A+ writer and an A+ photographer who put together a really good package.
The photograph is all the better because the story gives the details. That's an interesting photograph, but it doesn't really tell you what happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. It's supported. You're right.
I mean, you don't know if their hands are apart because he just let go or because he's just about ready to grab her.
Yes, yes. And the fact that there's already a death has occurred,
right.
and this is a life that can be saved.
Right. Yeah.
And is in the
Absolutely.
process of being saved, yes. Well, more than 25 years ago, a feature reporter for the Des Moines Register, Jane Shore Meisner, followed the story of a rape victim in Iowa. Her series of articles chronicling the victim's experiences, winning a Pulitzer Prize eventually for public service. That was in 1991. Jane's journalism experience now in her own words.
Back in 1990, when this series was published, people didn't talk about rape and rape victims. And when this article came out in the newspaper, they were surprised to see it. And to our surprise, they were receptive to talking about it. Some editors and reporters I know sit down and try to design a worthwhile project that will have an impact and maybe be an award-winning project. That's not how this one came about at all. The Register's editor at that time, Geneva Overholzer, had written an opinion piece. She believed that if we talked more openly about rape, that would help erase the stigma around it. And one of our readers, a woman in Grinnell, Iowa, read that opinion piece, and she was a rape victim herself. She called Geneva and asked for an appointment and came in to talk to her. And from that conversation, the rape victim said, well, if you believe that it will do some good, I will be willing to talk openly about this and let you use my name and photograph. It was finally given to me because I was perceived as a sensitive writer who could work with people, and especially with this woman on a sensitive issue. I think that every story I've ever written has had a lasting impact on me. This one in particular, did it have an effect on me? Yes, it drained me. I have never pretended that I remained emotionally detached. I did not. I felt her pain. I do know, and this continues to surprise me, that people remember this story. So it must have had an impact on some level. And what I would like to think about that is that it made people see the rape victim as a human being with feelings and with a family and with having to deal with all of this. That was what I wanted to get across.
Michael, I saw you shaking your head and nodding in agreement to some things that were said there. I am just curious what you remember this very vividly. I know you're very familiar with the facts about this and decisions that were made. What were you agreeing with, shaking your head?
Well,
yes.
I think, it took great courage on the part of Nancy Ziegemeyer to do that, but I thought it took a lot of courage on the part of Geneva to do that too. I mean, just because somebody agrees to tell their story doesn't mean that it's going to be widely embraced by your readers. It was controversial then. It might still be controversial today if you did that. So I thought it showed equal courage on the part of Geneva Overholser and the Register in general.
Does it make it easier, Anna, now for you to make a similar decision? And what topics do you think are taboo that are yet to be broken?
Oh. I think when you're talking about sexual assault victims, this piece is particularly powerful because it put the power back in her hands. And sexual assault and rape are such a crime of power struggles.
Yes.
And so I think it set a wonderful example, and it should, and I think, newspapers continue to uphold the standard that whether or not a victim is identified is really their choice.
Wow.
So,
no way.
Go ahead.
You think it's up to people? Well, what else do people get to choose about what's in the paper about them and what's not?
I think rape victims, particularly, the Register stance has been to not identify them, and I'm fine with that.
Wow.
Well, and that's the whole point of this, right? That's what Geneva Overholser was arguing, that we exacerbate the stigma by treating this differently.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
That if we don't name someone who's been sexually assaulted in a crime story, we have endorsed the notion that there is something shameful about that. That was her argument.
And you named the accused.
Yeah.
And then, okay, let's take this example. You name the accused, and there's a trial, and it's not guilty.
Sure.
Then will you name the person?
Yeah, I guess I don't know. I don't know.
Here's this. You've stigmatized. You don't want to stigmatize.
Sure.
This woman who turns out is not a victim.
Sure.
But you've stigmatized. You've called a guy a rapist.
Sure.
And he's not.
Well, if
why not be equal treatment? I mean, list one name or both. I mean, no names or both names.
Sure.
Michael, what would be your policy then if
List
you
both
were?
names.
I'm sorry?
Both names.
Both names.
I mean, you have a duty to your reader to tell them what's going on in their town, and I'm dreadfully sorry and aware of the angst that might cause some families. But I also think your first obligation is to your reader and to tell them as much as you can, and that means names. And the rest of the story is, like, half the people in town already know who it is.
Is that view prevalent?
No.
No, that you're sort of a lone wolf.
Well, no, not a lone wolf, but I mean a pack of wolves, but not the pack isn't as big as the other packs.
Yeah, we just haven't evolved yet. We haven't evolved in the industry, and we haven't evolved in society to deal with this type of issue. I remember when all of this was happening at the Register. I was over at the Gazette at the time. We watched it with admiration of the stance that was being taken. Geneva pushed Jane to really get into the details about what happened, and Nancy Ziegenmeyer was willing to talk about them, and she still is willing to talk about it.
When I was young, people never died of cancer. In the obituaries, you die, or in the news stories, you died of a long illness or a short illness. And the short illness was suicide or a gunshot or a heart attack, and a long illness was cancer or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then the cancer people said, well, that's ridiculous. And so they started asking. And then that brought about research. And the same thing happened with AIDS. Nobody wanted to say, you have AIDS, or my nephew has AIDS. And the AIDS community came. And so they wanted publicity. Say, this man died of AIDS, or this woman died of AIDS. And that brought about new research, and that's helped greatly reduce the number of AIDS.
Is this a question, I'll get to you, Chuck, is this a question of privacy versus the public's right to know? Is that what we're discussing here?
It's not privacy versus the public's right to know. It's privacy, I guess, versus the editor's obligation to tell.
I see. Chuck?
I'm struck how this would vary on the size of your community and, what kind of media you're talking about. I think, when this happens in a small town, it's a little bit different than when it happens on a statewide basis like this. And my sense on it is, I've never been in an editor's position where I had to make the call on this, but my sense on it is that every case is different. And, I can hear some of what I agree with in Michael's position and Anna's too. But I think every case is different. That's been my experience with them, and you have to make a call when you deal with that case.
Maybe, we've only got about 9 minutes left in our conversation here, and I want to move on to some other things, but is this an issue that is not yet settled and is going to be evolving? You're shaking your head, yes, Michael.
Oh, yeah, obviously it's not yet settled. We're sitting here disagreeing on it. It's not settled.
Yes. And do you think that we're evolving toward what? Any one thing, Anna?
I'm not sure. I think this is a topic that will continue to evolve. I think as you look at, I just finished a book on rape in college sports and how that has been covered differently over the last 20 years, and more and more often people are trying to tell those stories on a broader scale. But I don't know if we'll ever get to the point where newspapers are universally naming sex assault victims.
I think it's evolving toward more openness generally, and social media is having a role in that. But as we've just seen, there's also public pushback when the media gets out there and too frisky on pushing openness and full disclosure.
This is sort of a bridge question here to something else I want to discuss, but Michael, is news, I'll include print as well as television, but mostly television news, becoming more entertainment than it is, and is that coloring the way that we make judgments?
No, I don't think it's becoming more entertainment. I think fewer people are watching. My wife and I, we're of a certain age, and every night at 5:30 we sit down and we watch what my wife calls Lesterland. We watch Lester Holt on NBC, and then after about 20 minutes we switch over to Judy Woodruff to watch the rest of her show, because you guys scheduled it at the wrong time here on public television. But we're not exactly the audience people want. That's why you look at the advertisements on it. It's all for medicines.
I don't want to get into the past presidential campaign too much, but I was struck, and the reason I asked that question, I was struck by, before one of the presidential debates, they were filling some time ahead of the actual debate itself, and they were reporting some tweets across the screen. Yes. One woman had tweeted, "Got my popcorn safe and comfortable on the sofa. I'm ready to be entertained."
Well, that's because the guy running was an entertainer. I bet she wasn't talking about a Democratic debate.
It was a Republican debate.
Yeah, that was 9 entertainers up there, led by a ringmaster.
I want to get, Lyle, to community journalism in Iowa. Newspapers in Iowa, community newspapers, are thriving and doing well in contrast to some of the other dailies that are reducing staff and modifying their content. Am I right on that?
Well, the notion of thriving is relative. Newspapers used to operate on large margins. The margins are smaller. But in small communities, there still is this idea that, and I'm talking about a place like Mount Pleasant or North Liberty, somewhere like that, Jefferson, where if you want to know what's going on in town authoritatively, the local newspaper is the place to get that information. Now, there are local radio stations that will broadcast things. I think of the town of Washington, Iowa, with KCII Radio, and then the Washington Evening Journal, producing news and information for that community. You're not going to get that in the Cedar Rapids Gazette or the Des Moines Register or the Burlington Hawkeye because they don't care about that area as much. So I think in that sense, you still have this local avenue, but even in small communities, you have the invasion of disruptive technologies, which would be Facebook and things, especially Facebook.
That's disrupting community journalism?
It's disrupting community journalism in this way. The car dealer in a small Iowa town can now reach customers via Facebook. The local grocery store can reach customers via Facebook. And if they can do that instead of buy a double truck ad in the local paper, that disrupts local journalism because it takes away the income necessary to produce the local journalism.
I think that it just puts an extra burden on the local community journalist to be the best in town at Facebook and on Twitter and the social media. Use it in your business. You can't just stick to the old print product anymore.
And what's behind, Anna, I know you're with a daily, major daily in Iowa, but what's behind the current trend of Lee newspapers buying community newspapers, and the new owner of the Cedar Rapids Gazette is buying a string of Southeast Iowa community newspapers? What's behind that? What's driving that?
Well, I think there has been a backlash in maybe the last half dozen years or so of people feeling like the stories of their towns aren't being told. And there is audience there. There are people there who want to read about the communities they're living in. And I'm not sure newspaper companies, I started at a small newspaper in rural Oregon. I'm not sure those small town newspapers have always done a great job of bringing that news forward. They were trying to be too much to too many people. And they should be there to serve their communities.
Michael, I know that you're in on this trend. Tell me what you think.
I think you have to make a distinction between the ones that are locally owned, like Carroll, versus the ones that aren't. If it's locally owned, first of all, the people live in that community, and they face the people every day, and they want to face them with pride. Second of all, they're willing to take less money because they're not shipping it down to Atlanta or wherever this chain of 400 small newspapers is located. And third of all, they live there and they know their community. And so the Cullen brothers up in Storm Lake, Doug Brown and his Burns, and his family in Carroll, and they've bought a few others, and I'm sure they're maintaining the Moraine's standards in Jefferson, where they bought that paper. So, and those are terrific newspapers, But you can find some pretty crummy ones too.
Chuck, you haven't weighed in on this, but you've been watching it. Is it at all affecting the quality of community journalism?
It's better. I think it's better. I mean, I think the small community journalism that I see is better than it was when I was starting out in it a lot of years ago. But again, they've got more tools than they've ever had before, and they've got a more interested audience today because people know it's special. I mean, that they're really getting attention to their community in that media. I think they understand that. You know, Lyle, generally speaking, I would just say, I don't want to leave this with any kind of negativity because I am high on the state of journalism in Iowa today. I think we're in such an information age that I think we've just had this explosion of all kinds of media, and some of it's different from what I grew up on, but as long as there's more media, I'm all for it.
But Anna, it's really under threat now, is it not? There's a lot of questioning about the credibility of mainstream media.
Yeah. I try not to be too high or low on anything, but I'm hopeful. I mean, I still go to work every day and love what I do and love love the paper that I work for. I love the people I work with. And I think I still work with people who really care about this community, and they do their damnedest every day to bring you good coverage. So I'm hopeful. You know, I think there are struggles, but you know, I got
financial struggles.
Absolutely, and credibility struggles and all types of stuff. But I got my first job in a newspaper when I was 15, and I haven't left yet. So.
30 seconds, half the other.
We're in an era where people are demanding this type of information, and also there are good reporters in Iowa who are conscientious and care about their communities, and so they are addressing this need. I think that the public needs to understand that, and that journalists need to understand that the public itself has a lot of things that are tugging at it, and so they do have to do a good job of telling the truth.
I just want to say, in addition to thank you, congratulations to every one of you on your journalism careers. You are really achievers, and thank you so much.
Back at you.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
No kidding.
And again, thanks for joining us today and this important look back at profiles in journalism and a peek ahead in the future for all of us, covering and consuming news and information in the 21st century here in Iowa. For our entire Iowa Public Television crew in producing this look, I'm Dean Borg, and thank you for joining us today.
This program is supported by Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views and opinions expressed by this program do not necessarily reflect those of Humanities Iowa or the National Endowment for the Humanities.